So when I was in college, I went with my family up to St. Ignace, Michigan, where my uncle lives. And we were there over Labor Day weekend, and as we're driving across the Mackinac Bridge that connects Lower Peninsula, Michigan to Upper Peninsula, Michigan, my mom's driving, and she's very afraid of heights, and she's very afraid of bridges. And so she drove across, she managed to make it across, and we had a good time with my uncle and his family. But on Labor Day weekend, they have a walk where they invite people to walk across the bridge. And so my mom decided she was going to conquer her fear, and she was going to walk across the Mackinac Bridge. Now, the good news is it's only 5 miles long, and it's only 550 feet above the water. So she decided she's going to walk across the bridge, but she knew she'd need help. So she asked myself and my sister to walk on either side of her. Well, that was good until you get out kind of far, and there's grates, and you can actually look down and see the water below you. You can say she didn't do too well, but we managed to make it across. Now, my sister and I were not afraid of heights. So we enjoyed looking down the grates and looking at the water below us. We enjoyed sticking our head over the edge and looking at the water really far below. We enjoyed just kind of taking it all in. And one of the neat things, as we're walking across this bridge and we're taking it all in, I realized that I could see where we were coming from as we're crossing this bridge. I could look back and see where we've been. But I could also look ahead and see where we were going. They almost had like a finish line at the end. So I could see the old and the new, the beginning and the end, and we were on the bridge in the middle. Now my mother, of course, she kept focused on straight ahead. She didn't look around. But my sister and I really enjoyed looking what was behind us, what was ahead of us. We enjoyed the old and the new. In today's reading from Revelation, the writer, his name is John, he's very much standing on a bridge as he writes to us. And he's standing on a bridge and he's talking about the old and he's talking about the new. He talks about it in terms of the old heaven and the old earth. And then he says the new heaven and the new earth. So what does the old heaven and the old earth mean? What does the new heaven and the new earth mean? Well, Martin Luther talked about this quite a bit. And he talked about the old heaven was kind of when things were not working correctly. When things weren't working the way that they're supposed to be working, that's part of the old. So when things are working the way that they're supposed to be, the way that God designed them to work, that's the new. The new heaven, the new earth, where things are working correctly. The old heaven, the old earth, where things are not working correctly. So Martin Luther talked about we live in the old. We get to see the old all the time. But once in a while, we get glimpses of the new. So you might be wondering, what's an example of the old, of things not working the way they're supposed to be working? Well, I think a good example is the political climate right now in the United States. There's a huge divide. And you see this divide especially with political candidates in the ways that they interact with each other and talk about one another. You don't really see that commandment of love that we heard about in the children's time and in the gospel reading. It's an example of things not working the way that they were supposed to work. The old heaven, the old earth. Or if we look at our refugee situation right now, all across the world, at no other time in human history has there been this many refugees. God didn't create the world for us to be transplanted from our homes and for us to live somewhere else. That's the old earth, the old heaven. That's not the way the world was supposed to be. We look at our care for creation, caring for the environment, and understanding its implications on us and the people that we love. And we look at it and we might see litter or whatever, and we realize that's the old heaven, the old earth. That's not the way God had designed it. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Or we look at terrorism and we see people killing other people, and we ourselves live in fear. It's the old heaven, the old earth. That's not the way the world had been created. Or last Sunday or the Sunday before that, we talked about hunger, especially the Sunday before when Barbie Esquerdo came and talked about hunger issues in Philadelphia and reminded us of hunger issues here in Sheboygan, reminded us of hunger issues across the country and throughout the world. Hunger. People are not supposed to be hungry. That's the old heaven, the old earth. And even death is an example of the old heaven, the old earth. When people die, when relationships die, when people that we loved and our family members, when they die, we realize death is not supposed to be that way. Death was not part of the plan. That's part of the old heaven and the old earth. So many of us, well, all of us, we stand on a bridge where we see the old, but we also see the new. And that reminds us of an even more important bridge, the bridge known as the cross of Christ, which bridges the old and the new. As Jesus came down, he came down to show us that he is the bridge across those political divides that divide brother and sister, that divide father and mother. Jesus is that bridge across those political divides. Jesus came down in the form of a refugee who came up out of Egypt and showed us how to bridge that gap, how to be a welcoming person to other refugees. Jesus came down and died. His body was dead. But then he was resurrected, and that body that was once dead was now alive. Jesus came down to show us that's the way creation works. Even in death, things can be brought back to life. Even in creation, Jesus came down to bring new life to all creation. So we think about hunger and the hunger issues. Jesus came down to be bread for the world, to feed the hungry, to show us what it looks like to be that bridge for us. And most of all, Jesus was that bridge from death to life, from the old world to the new world. Jesus stands on that bridge with each one of us in the old world looking into the new world. So as we look into the new world and we see those glimpses of a new heaven and a new earth, you might be wondering, what are those glimpses of things working the way that they're supposed to? Well, I'm sure many of you have really great examples in your life and in the world. But I'd like to share just a few from the life of our congregation. So one great example is the Great Beginnings Preschool that we just saw. each of those preschoolers and the education and all the scholarships, you see a new heaven and a new earth. You saw them dancing around, all excited. A new heaven and a new earth. I think another great example is the mobile pack that we're having here, where we pack meals on May 20th and 21st. We also have childcare provided at the 8 to 10 a.m. slot on Saturday morning. And you think about that. You think about all of the hungry people that will be fed through these 100,000 meals. And you see a glimpse of the new heaven and the new earth. Or you think about the baptism that just took place with Loon, who's fast asleep right now. It must be my sermon. But you think about the baptism. That's new life, a new heaven, a new earth, as Loon is brought into the loving embrace of this congregation. Or I think about our Burmese families who are refugees, who are living here in Sheboygan, and I think about the warm embrace of the congregation, helping to provide furniture for them, helping to provide resources. I see a glimpse of the new heaven and the new earth. Or I think about the kitchen down in Fellowship Hall that's going to be remodeled, and the planning team that's putting all this effort into remodeling the kitchen and the costs and kind of what we're visioning and what we're looking at. This new kitchen is going to be better equipped to help feed the hungry. And it's a glimpse of that new heaven and that new earth. And I think about our music ministry program. We especially see the fruits of it here with Blended Worship, with all of these active participants. And you get to hear it, you get to feel it in worship. And it reminds me that this past week, we had a donation of a baby grand piano to the church that's down in the music room. We didn't wheel it all the way down to show it off, but I invite you to stop by and see it. But this donation, it's an image, a glimpse of a new heaven and a new earth. Each and every one of us stand on that bridge between the old and the new. And so often we see the old around us, but once in a while we have a glimpse of that new heaven and that new earth. And as we stand on that bridge, our God stands with us in the form of Jesus Christ. And our God beckons us to that new heaven and that new earth. Amen.